As the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump kicks off tomorrow, we've already showed you the cases both sides are planning to make, the timeline for the trial, the politics involved, and more. At this point, it is looking very unlikely that Democrats will be able to convince 17 Republicans to join them and vote to convict former President Trump. But there may be another way to hold Trump accountable for his role in inciting the riot at the Capitol, and this piece in Politico spells out just that possible avenue. Quote, if the Democrats' ultimate goal is to keep Trump from ever running again or appearing on a presidential ballot, there is still one avenue open to them. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It provides that, quote, no person shall hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. Now, the writer of that article says that hasn't been tested by the courts in more than a century. She's kind enough to join us now. Kimberly Wehle is a law professor at the University of Baltimore and a former federal prosecutor. And I want to talk about that avenue in a second. But for the audience and myself, I think we always look at that magic number. Where could they possibly find a dozen more Republicans to go along with the five that have shown even an inclination to possibly convict the president? But is that really the audience the House managers are laying out their case to? Or are they going instead, Kim, to the general public to see if the poll numbers go from, let's say, 56, 57% for removal up to possibly 70 if they lay out a convincing case and then the lawmakers come along? When they lay it out, who are they really making the appeal to?
Well, the question really comes down to the difference between an impeachment trial and a trial before a regular jury. Because as you indicate, the jurors here are members of the U.S. Senate, so they are elected. They hold office by virtue of the voters. So their job really is to act as proxies for voters in addition to upholding the Constitution per se. They sort of answer to two masters in a way. So to the extent to which the House impeachment managers actually want to change minds, it is the minds of the public and potential pressure then on members of the U.S. Senate to hold Donald Trump accountable with a conviction, which could then lead to a ban on holding public office under Article 2's impeachment clause.
As a former federal prosecutor, do you think the approach, at least we're being led to believe, that the House managers are going to take is the right one this time around? And simply put, there's going to be a lot of video. They're making the assumption a lot of people have an idea of what happened on January 6th, but maybe not the TikTok that got us to that point. Little in the way of witnesses and more in the way of accounts about what happened that day and an inside look that maybe a lot of the public hadn't seen before. Do you think the appeal to the heart more than the head is the sharper way to go?
Well, I actually would like to see witnesses called. I do think having witnesses, police officers, talk about what it was like to be there in the scene. One called it, according to impeachment manager's brief, a medieval type sort of event with the kinds of physical weapons that people had and the violence and hostility towards law enforcement. We could also hear from people that were within the mob, over 100 have been arrested, who believe that Donald Trump did call them, or they believe that he called them to this kind of action, because that's essentially what the burden is here, is to show that Donald Trump had an important role, but for Donald Trump, January 6th would not have happened. I would also like to hear from people that were around Donald Trump and can convey what his mentality was, because we do know that even after the mob started saying, "Hang Mike Pence," Donald Trump tweeted that Mike Pence was a coward. That reaction to an angry mob certainly suggests that he wasn't just anticipating peaceful verbal protests. And I think that witnesses would help the impeachment managers potentially change minds rather than just restate what we've all seen to a large degree on television.
And to supplement that, I remember Maggie Haberman had reporting in the Times that apparently during the actual riots, the president was nonplussed looking around the room, that not everybody thought it was as terrific an unfolding an event as he did. So apparently he wasn't really too shaken up by it, if you believe some of the accounts from within that room, albeit unsourced. a couple process questions. So can Democrats say, okay, we're going to try to convict at the trial phase now? If that doesn't work, then let's try a censure model. Can they go behind door number 2 if they don't get a conviction at the trial phase?
Well, there's nothing banning a censure. The question is, does that really have an impact or an effect? And my understanding is reportedly that the Democrats don't want to do it, at least now, because they want full impeachment. And the Republicans don't want to do anything that would preclude Donald Trump from running for office again. So a censure is a possibility, but the question is that enforceable? So imagine at this moment, of course, the only mechanism of accountability left through impeachment would be a ban on holding public office. So imagine there's a censure. He gets on a ballot later. Whether that censure could actually be enforced in court, I think, is an open question. It's something they could certainly try, and then someone with standing would have to say, listen, there's a censure out there. We have to take Donald Trump's name off the ballot. That's I think, untested going forward as to whether that would have the effect that that an actual conviction and a sentencing of banning from future office would have if the impeachment process were to be successful for the Democrats.
I laid out what you wrote about, which I hadn't heard before, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and it seemed as if it was written for this exact event. How would that work, and is it the same standard? You'd need 67 votes to go along with it? How does the math work?
So that provision of the Constitution is in the 14th Amendment. So it happened after all of the original impeachment clauses. It's 6 times in the Constitution that the word impeachment appears. So this is something the framers really cared a lot about. This was not something that should be narrowly construed. But after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, essentially the people were worried about the losing side, the Confederate side, winning office and then making it really difficult to heal after the Civil War. So that provision was put into place to basically keep those that sort of rebelled against the Union from then coming into office again. The Congress at the time passed a series of statutes to implement the various amendments to the Constitution after the Civil War, including that one, and included a provision that makes it a crime, a misdemeanor, actually, to run for office if you are an insurrectionist, and also allows prosecutors to go in and enjoin or stop someone from running for office. So my argument, or what I suggested in the piece that you mentioned, is that Congress pass a separate law that would make a civil cause of action possible. So Congress could pass a law that makes it possible for, say, a future candidate for office, seeing Donald Trump on the ballot, to say, you know what, this is a problem. I want you, judge, to issue a ruling to hold him accountable under the 14th Amendment. Now, of course, that would have legal challenges. I'm not estimating that it would be constitutionally upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, but it would be a mechanism for the Congress to implement the 14th Amendment rather than just go through the prosecutorial route that many people are talking about, which would require the Biden administration or a local prosecutor to take that action. Congress needs to shore up its authority as a coordinate branch of government after many, many years of basically handing over its power to the president.
And finally, anybody who has read even a little of what was going through the founding fathers when they're creating the charter for this country, the idea that they want an omnipotent executive branch here and that you couldn't hold the president to account for the actions he did as a president is beyond specious. And I know the Trump team's arguing that. But more broadly, Kim, what would the consequences be if, after everything that happened, there are no consequences for trying to lead an insurrection in this country, which fits into that narrow definition, if you want to do it, of what sedition actually means? What happens if at the end the numbers aren't there and then the president basically just walks?
Well, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. It doesn't do anything to enforce itself. So it's like a contract. If someone walks off the job, you've paid them a down payment, you've got to go to court to enforce that contract. The contract doesn't do it itself. So if there's no consequences for what happened on January 6th, that means that the 14th Amendment's ban on insurrections doesn't have any real meaning, and the Congress doesn't really care if every single time we elect a new president, the outgoing president basically wages an attack on the Capitol while the U.S. Congress is sitting in session, counting the Electoral College votes, and leads to potentially widespread, violence, physical attack on the Capitol, and death. That would become the new normal, because the Congress would essentially be shrugging this off and saying, it's okay to do this in America.
Kim Wehle, really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, folks, when we come back, we're going to take a look at Biden's ambitious agenda for the first 100 days. I should also note, by the way, he says that when the trial's going on, he's going to be working on COVID relief. And when we come back for the break, we're going to focus on COVID, including Biden's plan. Democrats, they're working on, getting a whole lot of money out into the public's pockets. We'll be joined by a Democratic congressman to talk about that and more. And an ER doctor from New York City will talk about the very latest when it comes to the virus itself.